My name is Brad Ambury. I'm a lead educational developer. I focus primarily in the areas of assessments and evaluations. And I am very excited to be here today to talk to you about mirror, criticality, personal narrative, and reflective teaching. When I thought about the talk this morning, how was I going to introduce the important roles critical reflection, personal narrative can play in teaching practice and developing as a teaching professional, I thought about what might be most interesting, what might be most interesting or unusual or useful. And then I began to think about what is it that might help those who haven't really considered reflection and incorporating reflection as part of their practice. And then there are, of course, those of you who probably reflect on an almost daily basis, and you use reflection as a tool in your professional development repertoire. So at the end of the day, what I decided to do is to try and demonstrate how critical reflection can help us engage with different perspectives to explain, justify, challenge, primarily our own assumptions. And we'll see how I think engaging in critical reflection can allow us to take a step back, allow us to take a deep breath, and then begin to think through the various problems and issues we'll likely encounter in our teaching practice. And it's also an opportunity for us to analyze what we've learned and how it is that we learn, with the aim to take control of our professional practice. Today, I plan on highlighting important aspects of reflective practice as I explore narrative. And I'm going to do this by focusing on a few stories taken from my own classrooms and my own personal professional journey. Why stories? I think narrative is a viable option for the reflective practitioner. I think it is useful as a mode of inquiry, but also is the way it helps us construct ways of understanding and ways of knowing ourselves and others. And so today we're going to explore what it means to produce a narrative that asks us to reflect on our actions as teachers, as human beings, and how we are based, located socially and contextually. We'll also talk about how this kind of written inquiry, if you will, can help us reach new understandings, to adopt new practices, and to explore hypotheses with respect to our own practices that we can possibly implement to improve or further develop our teaching practice. Now, before I share a few stories with you, we probably should ground our conversation with a quick overview of several educational theorists whose work holds special meaning to those wanting to integrate self-reflection into their professional practice. I begin with a fairly well-known figure, the progressive educator, philosopher, John Dewey. Now, Dewey felt reflective thinking, or which he called inquiry, involved an intentional form of deliberation on a problem. And his approach bordered on the scientific, quite frankly. And he wanted the teacher, the practitioner, to explore the kind of thinking that consists in turning a subject over in the mind, giving it serious consecutive consideration in light of grounds that support it and further conclusions to which it tends. Dewey, in many cases, clearly linked reflection to problem, or what he probably would have called perplexities. And reflective inquiry of his kind asked the professional practitioner to undertake specific experimentally styled investigations. And these are typically undertaken to resolve puzzles, troubling situations, or things that come up in the context of the teaching practice. Here, Dewey's not, with the 6 steps of his inquiry, he's not talking about the kinds of routine and matter-of-fact deliberations on teaching that we make as part of our everyday actions in the classroom. Rather, inquiry and reflection for Dewey requires systematic, rigorous, and disciplined approaches. It encourages, he felt, educators to question their assumptions through reflection, to direct our actions with foresight, and to enable us to know what we are about as teachers when it is we act. Another scholar, thinker to consider is Donald Schön, who in the 1980s produced, I think it was 83, The Reflective Practitioner. And therein he offered an alternative but complementary approach to reflection. Schön was a little different in his focus, and he looked at reflective thought and how it's embedded in or on actions that take place in or around the teacher's activities in the classroom. He coined a couple of terms that you probably will see quite often in the literature tied to teaching reflections. And the terms are reflection in action and reflection on action. Now, Schön emphasized that professionals always find themselves facing situations that are unique and of the moment. And he posited that these situations, instructors tend to use their knowledge and past experience as a method to frame or reframe their actions in the classroom in the moment. He writes, often our knowing is the spontaneous, intuitive performance of everyday life. We are knowledgeable in a special way. And by this, he meant to refer to the quick thinking, quick reframing, quick decisions to act that teachers do all the time in the classroom, right? If we see students who aren't understanding an activity or they don't seem to understand the specific meaning associated with a topic being discussed in class, reflection in action, as he talks about it, speaks to the teacher's ability to see the problem, to see the issue, and then to consider quickly why it's happening and to respond by making adjustments and by perhaps doing the activity differently or explaining the topic differently. Schön, who was very interested in what the teacher might be thinking about while they were teaching, was still, like Dewey, especially interested in the teacher, what the teacher was thinking when they faced problems. So in many respects, both Schön and Dewey are ends-based in terms of their approaches. They're usually interested in a problem that's perceived by a teacher and wishes to be solved as the teacher goes through different iterations of reflection until a solution is inevitably, hopefully, reached. The key for us is that both Dewey and Schön call for professionals to better understand their actions by thinking about their actions. Once again, I'll just quickly touch on reflection in action and reflection on action. Reflection in action is the kind of reflection the teacher can practice when in the classroom, when in the moment. So this is reflection that happens during the event. Reflection on action is usually something that occurs post-event and is something that is more deliberate and probably more rigorous in that the teacher, the practitioner, the reflective thinker is often able to puzzle through and ponder a problem, turn it around in their head, and then move forward with what they believe to be the possible solutions. Again, the key is that we think about our actions in order to reframe and alter, transform, change our practices so that we meet the needs of our students in our classrooms. We now come to the first of my stories. There will be 3 stories, and I hope I don't bore you. but here we go. So when I look back at my early days, and that was a long time ago in a galaxy far away, I realized that many of my early reflections on my teaching were primarily initiated because of problems, dilemmas I faced. And that means then that my reflections primarily were driven by and fall into either of the domains that Schön talks about, the reflection in action or reflection on action. I suspect, were I to be honest with myself and with you, many or most of my early attempts at reflection were driven by problems I had in the classroom. Often I found myself caught up in moments when my teaching plans went awry. Students struggled with difficult concepts. Students were restless. Activities were taking, so much longer than I'd planned for, and on and on and on. I found myself in the moment, of course, having to think on my feet, to see the problem, to draw on my prior experiences, use my then limited knowledge of teaching and learning, and to reframe what I was attempting to do, to change up what was happening in the classroom so that I would better reach, connect, engage with the students. Gradually, over the course of it was probably my first year, I made the conscious decision to begin to record these kinds of these micro events, if you will, these micro reflections. And so I didn't call it this at the time, but in hindsight, I recognized that it truly was a reflection journal. And there in this journal, I recorded as best I could a record of what transpired in the classroom, what I saw as the possible problems, dilemmas, issues I was facing, and what it is I did in the class to attempt to deal with those matters at the time. It was a great idea, as this reflection journal for me later helped me report out to my teaching progress, my teaching practice to my supervisors. I also used this journal when it came time to, in the terms that would follow, develop my courses and develop my future lesson plans. Speaking of lesson plans, in the early days, lesson planning was a standard part of my practice. I quickly realized, however, that my journal comments didn't always mesh very well with my lesson plans. So when I look back on these things, journal and lesson plans, I often couldn't align the two. This was frustrating, and I chalked that up to my inexperience. But it was one of those days when I was probably tearing out my hair, and I had an aha moment. And it dawned on me, perhaps for the first time, that, Brad, you could just very simply add a reflection section to your lesson plan. There, you could record these experiences, these dilemmas, these problems you were facing in class, and how it was you were attempting to resolve them. And so it was that I did this, and that was for me a game changer. When I look back on my collected reflections in my lesson plans from the previous year, truthfully, it provided me with lots of fuel that fired up my more deliberate and thoughtful attempts to reflect on my practices and determine new actions in the future. So the reflection journal fed into my lesson plans. And so that was a very important development early on for me. And it's something that I would certainly suggest people out there consider if they're not already adopting or following this kind of practice. Moving on, continuing with my story, I think I was in the middle of my first course. I was teaching a Japanese language course. No, I don't look like I speak Japanese, but I do. And when I received notification that it was my turn, I was next up on the peer observation list. When the time came, the observation happened, and the observer sent me her signed review. Now, she put her number next to her signature and asked me to call her. I thought that was probably a sign that this was going to go bad. But truthfully, it ended up being an incredibly rewarding experience. While she was complimentary, she also pointed to specific items and inconsistencies that she saw between my lesson plan that I provided her and the actual lesson. Now, thankfully, her remarks didn't so much suggest what I should do as much as what I could do when certain kinds of opportunities presented themselves in my class. At one point, I remember in our exchange, she asked me to do a couple of things. One was to review my lesson plan, its organization, and then to try and summarize for each of the sections of my lesson plan what my aims were for that particular portion of the lesson. I was surprised. I found this to be quite challenging, but it was an opportunity, I guess, in a sense, to reverse engineer my lesson plan. And doing so helped me see how I'd organized my original plan and how I might improve upon it by adjusting sections here and there, or moving an activity from the beginning to the end. But it also helped me identify gaps, and gaps that I would have otherwise been completely unaware of, and for how long, I'm not quite certain. Thankfully, the observer was kind. She didn't so much as tell me how and what to teach when. Instead, she chose to leave the work to me. I now realize she was encouraging my professional growth. She was giving me the space, the time needed to reflect on my practices, giving me some gentle prompts and guidance, but allowing and honoring my right to work things out to learn for myself. And I found that relationship to be incredibly productive for me. Now, in the review, I will not forget this. The teacher also asked me a question about which comes first, the chicken or the egg. No, she didn't ask me that question. What she asked me was, which comes first, your lesson objectives or your selection of activities? Truthfully, at the time, it was hands down activities. Very much motivated by forward design. I realize now I attempted very much to identify the content of the lesson and then decide what my activities, what my teaching methods and activities would be. Her question, though, encouraged me to explore other options. And so it was then that I eventually, after doing a little bit of research, doing a little bit of reading, came to be aware of backward design, where outcomes, lesson objectives are clearly stated, and the focus is identifying at the end of the day what the student will be able to do. This was a game changer for me, and certainly turned out to be a very practical suggestion, and it marked a helpful shift, particularly when it came to framing assessments and study expectations from my students. We're going to return to a discussion of reflective practices related to specifically teaching. I've placed a framework on the screen, and this is the framework of an educator specialist in TESOL, specifically teaching English as a second language. Thomas Farrell's holistic framework for reflecting on teaching practice. Now, Why do I post that? Why do I turn to this? Simply because there was a certain point in my teaching career when I realized that I was doing things in a piecemeal fashion, a piecemeal manner. Even though I had turned to others for assistance, I had turned to the local version of our CTL, our Center for Teaching and Learning. I realized that I wasn't putting necessarily everything together. So at a certain point, I began to seek out a model or a framework of some kind. And I wanted something that would help me put the pieces together. And I present to you Farrell's framework as just such a model. I'm not saying it's the end, the be end. I'm not saying that this is I don't want to shove this particular framework down your throat and say this is the one you must follow. Ultimately, the model or framework that fits for you, works for you, is something that will be determined by the individual in many cases. In most cases, I would suspect. But I do want to put this out there as a holistic framework that speaks to the cyclical nature of reflective practice. For Farrell, there are 5 stages. The first stage is philosophy. And here, it's not teaching philosophy necessarily, although it's tied to it. Farrell wants the teacher to look at themselves in the form of teacher as person. This is an opportunity for teachers to obtain self-knowledge and to reflect on their background and previous life experiences that may shape their teaching identity. Principles. This requires that the teacher, the practitioner, reflect on their principles, their values and expectations tied to their teaching practice. How do their values, their expectations fit with their actual classroom practice? Is there a match? Is it aligned, or is it mismatched? Theory. Farrell encouraged the teacher to consider how theories about teaching can be translated and applied to specifically the classroom and their teaching practice. Now, this can entail not only knowledge tied to teaching and learning, but also could speak to professional or subject area knowledge as well. Practice. This is the kind of reflection that occurs when the teacher self-reflects on their own teaching, utilizes records or recording devices of various kinds to observably be able to view and assess their teaching practices in the classroom. This is also very closely tied to peer observation. Gives the teacher the chance to test, compare aspects of their teaching, perhaps with others. And it's also an opportunity for the teacher to examine whether the actions they're taking in the classroom are consistent with their reflections in the earlier stages of this framework. Farrell thinks that the inconsistencies that are to be found between the various levels of a framework sometimes can be as informative as the consistencies. Beyond practice. This is the final phase of reflection, and it asks teachers to momentarily step outside the classroom and explore factors, moral, political, social, that may influence their teaching context. Reflection at this stage encourages teachers to engage in a critical dialogue, if you will, with their teaching. And hopefully will help them develop an awareness of the impact of their lessons, considering, again, greater extra classroom phenomenon. As I said, I put forward the Farrell framework as an example. I don't intend to declare it's the one you should follow, the one you should use. But the key point is that a detailed, layered, and integrated process for reflection, whatever the model, whatever the framework, can greatly benefit professional teaching practice. Now, we turn to the next part of my story. We jump ahead several years. I was part of a small group of instructors, but for a number of reasons, we rarely met. Usually, our meetings were restricted to start, end of term, the odd meeting during the term. This was incredibly isolating and incredibly frustrating. At some point, I reached out to a couple of my fellow instructors, and after talking about our various frustrations with what was going on, we struck upon the idea of forming a mutual teaching observation arrangement. Each of us agreeing to visit the other's classes and to follow up the observations with informal feedback or conversation sessions. We agreed we'd try and keep the arrangements low key, low stakes, so as to minimize any pressure that each of us might feel. But we also carefully explained to our students what we're doing and why. The arrangement, similar to what today is called the teaching square, gave each of us the chance to informally gather feedback and to gather evidence that spoke to our respective and specific practices. As I progressed in my career, I was able to actually link the evidence gathered informally to my teaching aims. And I began to be able to address how the evidence reflected not only my strengths and my accomplishments in the classroom, but also, thankfully, but sadly, the areas in which I needed to continue to grow and improve if I was going to become an accomplished practitioner. Much as Farrell's framework suggests, what I noted at the time was that much of my reflective practice began to feel more interconnected. One level influenced my reflective work at the other level. And this is why I had sought out a framework or a model for reflection. I found it to be incredibly useful for that reason. Now, the second part of the story involves a time when I was asked by my department to put together a nomination for a graduate student teaching award. The surprise, I was the student. Now, this is the first time I'd sat down and thought about and was tasked with providing a formal written assessment of my teaching practice. Ironically, in many ways, the components of this nomination form mirror what is now becoming a requisite part of our professional practice, the teaching dossier. So this suits our purposes quite well, I think. And so I will reference dossier building throughout this particular story. Compiling evidence of my teaching roles, responsibilities, well, that was fairly straightforward. When it came to describing the quality of my teaching practice, what sets my teaching apart, what is innovative or exceptional, that was more difficult. I found I had to wade through my materials, and I eventually was able to select what I thought to be my most engaging lesson plans, my most interactive teaching activities, and those assignments and assessments that I felt to be representative of my particular approaches to engaging students and encouraging learning in my classrooms. Now, evidence from students. Well, at the time, this was straightforward. I included teaching evaluations, of course, and letters. Now, letters were written expressions of support offered by students. Today, if asked to include evidence from students, I would definitely expand the range of materials I'd likely include. I'd probably include formative, perhaps summative feedback gathered from my students during the course. I would probably, well, not probably, I would definitely include samples of student work, highlighting what I thought to be key learnings and key demonstrations of students being able to achieve what it was that was set out in the course outcomes, if you will. And if I had access to information, I'd probably list student achievements or accomplishments beyond my particular course. In terms of evidence from colleagues and peers, well, thankfully, I had a host of materials from which to draw on. Now, the one thing is most of that information was informal. I had very few formal peer evaluations or reviews or observations at this particular point in time. So at the end of the day, what I had to do was I asked specific professors for official letters of support with respect to my teaching. That necessitated visits, extra visits to my classroom. But, you know, as it turned out, those visits themselves provided further opportunity for me to reflect on and refine my teaching practices. So again, like Farrell's framework suggests, the various levels of reflection do in turn feed one into the other. So professional learning and development. This, I probably underestimated the importance of this. I simply listed and provided details outlining the various formal and informal professional development opportunities I participated in. Today, though, in a teaching dossier, I would encourage people to not do that. I would encourage people to specifically reflect on and try to address things like, why did you engage in the professional learning? How did these learning experiences influence your beliefs and influence your teaching practices? Can you directly connect your educational professional development activities to what is happening in your class courses now? If so, and if you can do that, then in this particular section of a teaching dossier, professional learning and development, I might include samples of student work that shows evidence of the student impacts that these kinds of professional learnings have had. This again demonstrates demonstrates your commitment, I think. And lastly, in this particular section or portion of a dossier, I would likely make mention of current and future goals. What are my ambitions with respect to my teaching? This will demonstrate that you're not resting on your laurels, and that you understand that learning and developing teaching, your teaching, is an ongoing process. Come now to the philosophy statement. This is the part I struggled with the most, I think. Who doesn't? I mean, how do you in one or two short pages describe what you believe about teaching and student learning? Why you hold the beliefs you do? Follow that up with brief highlights demonstrating how you put these beliefs into practice. Ouch. I truthfully struggled with this. But today there are a lot of tools, a lot of resources available that can help folks with this rather daunting task. So if you're attempting to write a philosophy statement of your own, don't worry. There are folks out there, including myself and others at CTL, who would be more than happy to help you write your philosophy statement, and hopefully in one one holistic summary of your teaching, one that will take in all the aspects of the kinds of framework that Farrell speaks of. Now, in the time that's remaining for me, I think I want to turn to criticality and critical reflection. Here, we're going to enter the waters inhabited by Paulo Freire, who demonstrated so clearly that a neutral, apolitical education practice doesn't exist. Freire, he was concerned, of course, with the oppressive nature of much pedagogical practice and pointed to the necessity of employing radical actions if we were to effect positive political change, political or social change. Freire was talking about real change, the kind that can only begin to happen when educators recognize the implicitly political nature of their professional endeavor. Freire's ideas put in place a new concept, critical transformative reflection. He sets this out and sets it apart from reflective thinking, inquiry of Schön and Dewey's kind. And so critical reflection implies the application of critical theory with ties them to positive, uplifting, if you will, goals that are linked to issues, for example, social justice, and so forth. So I'm going to further talk a little bit about how it is that a teacher, instructor can reflect critically on their practice. And for that, I turn to Stephen Brookfield. Brookfield, of course, was, I believe, one of the keynotes at last year's OTI. And he tells us that critical reflection is necessary to becoming a good teacher. He, like Freire, also believes that not all reflection is critical. For him, a reflective practitioner or teacher can stand outside their practice, can see actions and impacts from wider perspectives, and they know that content, assessment practices, these are all social products that are located in a time and space, and that they may unknowingly be complicit with inequities in wider society. So Brookfield gives us 4 critical lenses that serve as mirrors, windows, if you will, for us to utilize to reflect on our practice. The most important lens for Brookfield is students. Students' eyes, he calls it. This is the way that we can become aware of our assumptions, particularly ones we've missed or never been aware of. And in the case of students, Brookfield tells us specifically to speak to students, to dialogue with students. And how do we do this? How do we become aware of students' experience of learning? Well, aside from the usual sources, teaching evaluations, student assessment results, student journals, those kinds of activities, Brookfield prizes the use of back channels and anonymity to solicit regular critical feedback on his teaching from students. He suggests that the instructor also make a point of discussing the feedback he receives from students routinely. This is done to help establish 1, trust, and 2, by engaging in dialogue with his students, it quickly, he feels, reveals teaching habits that may need to be adjusted in the name of student equity, or to identify habits that actually have had positive results and can be built upon later in the class. The second lens, colleagues' perceptions. Brookfield calls them trusted friends. He thinks that this is incredibly important. So critical colleagues or peers will help you unearth and check your assumptions. We talked about this earlier when we talked about the teaching square. Brookfield builds on it, though, in that, in my case, this was this kind of observations and reflections were done in a single discipline, even within the context of a single course. Brookfield suggests multidisciplinary groups be formed because he feels that this is an incredibly productive way for teachers to be exposed to new ways of thinking about things and discovering genuinely new ways to think about problems they may be facing in their classrooms. Personal experience. Much like Farrell, Brookfield stresses the importance of the mirror of personal reflection. He suspects that our personal experiences of learning play a large role in shaping our attitudes about teaching. This is very interesting and something certainly each of us could probably explore. What excited you about learning when you were a kid? Who was your favorite teacher? What did they do in the class, right? These kind of things may be a heck of a lot more influential than you think. And they may be why you gravitate towards certain kinds of things in the classroom and why you avoid certain others. So there may be no solid pedagogical reason for why you do these things, but it could be based, in fact, on your early experiences as whether a child or as a young student in university. Finally, the final lens, theory. Now, although Brookfield encourages people, teachers, to engage and consult with educational research, he is here primarily concerned with something else entirely. And he is looking to, in his words, disturb the status quo, possibly explode settled worldviews. Brookfield applies aspects of critical theory to his classroom practices in order to reveal the workings of power, explicit and implicit, in and beyond the classroom. He's sympathetic to those, perhaps some in the audience, who resent the obtuseness of much critical theory. And, hear. However, he cites and says the mirror of critical theory can provide fresh perspective, fresh insights, and they can help clarify for many teachers certain kinds of feelings, certain kinds of suspicions they may have about their professional practice. So quickly, we don't have much time, so I'm going to recount a very short story, and we will end with that. At one point in time, I was asked to present a brief paper and presentation at an upcoming forum. For whatever reason, perhaps I was refreshed by a particularly invigorating teaching experience. I decided to talk about teaching practice rather than the standard topics that I might have addressed otherwise. And so it was that I drew on Farrell and others, and I spoke about, in this presentation, I spoke about my political anti-authoritarian approaches to designing, developing, and teaching a student-centered survey course that I felt was sure to unsettle traditional practice. We talked about canon, my creation of a counter canon, highlighting women authors, marginalized authors, popular culture, and so on, to interrogate modern constructions of capital L literature. Now, in the room, there were, as you might imagine, some chagrined faces, probably unhappy with my particular approach, but there were also some who nodded along. Where things really got interesting in that particular forum, though, was when I talked about my decision to experiment with critical incident questionnaires in my class. The critical incident questionnaire, according to Brookfield, is a practical illustration of critical reflection in action. And my questions differed, but they were they were close enough that I've decided to use Brookfield questions because I think they serve us well. And it's a tool that is used to gain insight into students' experience of the critical moments that are happening in the classroom. The reaction in the room, again, was less than enthusiastic. Many were very uncomfortable with this notion of reaching out to students, of getting student feedback on my teaching. Many felt it was a waste of time. They were concerned that it was going to impact my coverage, that it might distract from student learning. But when I responded to their questions, their queries, I tried to set their minds at ease by telling them that this practice provided me with knowledge I likely would not have ever gotten, or I've never had access to. And during the course, as it was being delivered, as I shared these incident questionnaires on a weekly basis, and then reviewed and shared the results with my students, I became aware of, for instance, potential problems that I was able to cut off at the pass. It helped, I think, establish sort of a common meeting ground for students. We were able to develop levels of trust that I otherwise may not have been able to establish. It also, I think, encouraged a kind of metacognition on the part of the students. I think some of my students began to see that they were repeating their responses to the questions over and over again. And I suspect what they began to do was change their actions. They began to self-regulate their learning as a result of this practice, which demonstrated to them that perhaps they weren't as on top of things and their learning as they might have otherwise been. I think, though, the thing that shocked me and was the point I tried to make with this group was the sheer variety of responses was stunning. And for the first time, I think I was truly able to recognize the far-reaching nature of the diversity of the learners that were present in my classroom. And my eyes were opened and my teaching practice was changed because I became aware of the fact that all learners are indeed not equal and that everyone experiences learning differently. And so while I didn't satisfy everyone in the room that day, more than a few were waiting to talk to me at the end. And that provided me with all the validation I needed to continue to explore and to expand on my teaching practices, and specifically my reflective teaching practices. So with that, brings us to the end of my storytelling and our presentation. So thank you all for your patience, your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.